Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, how big things become small. Among all forms of energy, the fastest growth is for electricity. And that's making people look to every possible technology, including nuclear. Last week, we talked about how the West has been struggling to build big nuclear power plants in recent decades. Today, we'll talk about small modular reactors, what some say could be the solution to the problem. Don't build large, build small. The idea is enticing. Take something that's big and hard to build and expensive, shrink it down to something that's more manageable, easier to replicate, perhaps even cheaper. Instead of one huge nuclear power plant, you build 10 small ones. But right now, these kinds of small modular reactors are very much in the startup phase, with only 2 in commercial operation, in Russia and in China. There are hundreds of different designs vying to be the next success story, all with their own pros and cons. And there are, of course, concerns about safety. So, how viable is the business for these small modular reactors? Will SMRs ever become a scaled-up solution for our energy needs and climate goals? This week on Zero, I'm joined again by Rachel Slaybaugh. She's a partner focused on climate sustainability and energy at the venture capital firm TCVC, where she has made investments in startups that are shrinking nuclear reactors. Before that, she was a tenured professor of nuclear engineering at the University of California in Berkeley. Rachel talks us through where we are in the development stage for SMRs, why she's not worried about having SMRs in her garden, and why wind, solar, and nuclear developers should team up to take on the fossil fuel lobby. This is the second of 2 episodes looking at the development of nuclear fission technologies. If you didn't listen to the first one, we've put a link in the show notes. Rachel, welcome back to Zero.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So last week on the show, we covered large-scale nuclear. This week, I want to talk about SMRs, small modular reactors. Now, there are already 2 of these reactors, one in Russia and in China, but Western governments don't want those technologies. So these Western countries are making their own bets. Canada has approved building 2 reactors. The UK is approved 1. The Tennessee Valley Authority in the US wants to build 1. And then there are hundreds of companies with their own designs. So let's just start with the basics. What has already been approved in construction for SMRs, and which Western governments are willing to pay for them?
Yeah, this is changing all the time. I'm probably not going to get the current list right, but I will point out one of the reactors that's likely to be built first, especially in Canada, is called the BWRX 300, and that's from General Electric. And that is one of these sort of crossovers where it's a light water reactor. It's a boiling water reactor design, but it's small and modular. It's 300 megawatts. And so that is one of the bridge faster paths forward because the design is not that different from the designs before. The supply chain is really similar. And so maybe you don't get some of the benefits of the advanced reactors, but you can move more quickly and you don't have to wait for supply chain build out. And so it's kind of a good bridge technology. And like all of these things, if actually we build a bunch of them on that bridge, maybe that becomes the technology that is one of the winners in the long run.
And yet it is true there are 100 plus small modular reactor designs available. And sure, we could play the free market game of letting the market decide which of these reactor designs we should pick. And that might take 100 years to decide. We don't have that time. At what point do you go, this is where governments need to come in, decide, we need to narrow the field down drastically, and perhaps pick a few winners and let that competition create the ecosystem to have nuclear?
I think because nuclear is such a specific technology where there are things that are inherently more sensitive than some other technologies, government is always going to be involved, and that's important. It also requires real expertise to understand what is more likely to work and what is more likely to hit their cost targets. And I think it's not reasonable to expect all customers to be able to figure that out. And so again, it makes sense because there's so much expertise required to have some government participation here. And you can see that in some of these research programs. And like in the US, there's the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program where there are a range of technologies supported, but 2 large demos selected. And one of them is a sodium-cooled fast reactor, and one of them is a TRISO-fueled gas reactor. And those are really sensible choices because those are the 2 reactor technologies where we have the most experience and the most data. And so those ones sensibly would be the first ones you would support to demonstrate, because that's, we've had gas reactors in the UK. We've had sodium fast reactors in France. We've had both of them also in the US. So those technologies aren't ones where we don't have any experience.
Okay, well, this is the time to get nerdy about advanced reactors. So talk us through the main categories of these reactor designs. As you said, some of them have been tested, but some of them are yet to be tested. So what has been tested and why did we even try those things in the first place?
So we have sodium fast reactors, and that's where sodium is the heat transfer media, and we have metal fuel. Those are the reactors where you can use a recycling process. And they have really strong safety features because metal or sodium is a really powerful heat transfer mechanism. So if anything happens in the reactor, you can get the heat out really quickly and keep the fuel safe. There are, let's say, 3 other major bins. So there's high temperature gas reactors. And so they use typically helium as the heat transfer medium. And the fuel is in very durable, robust kernels called TRISO particles. They're teeny little kernels that have like layers of ceramic around them, so they're incredibly durable. And so the particles themselves can't really melt. So helium, it's a gas. It's not as good of a heat transfer mechanism. So in gas reactors, the safety comes from the fuel form. The fuel just can't melt down. It's super rugged. And then if you have a loss of coolant accident where the helium is lost, the heat transfer properties of air are not so wildly different. So it's not as big of a deal. And those tend to operate at higher temperatures. We've built the most of those reactors. And then the third category that has 2 subcategories is molten salt reactors. And so we have built an experimental molten salt reactor at Oak Ridge National Lab. And this is where there are several different approaches, but you can, instead of fabricating the fuel into some kind of solid material, you dissolve the fuel into the salt. So the fuel is actually a liquid. It's a eutectic, technically. And so the fission happens in the molten salt eutectic. And some of the benefits of those, molten salt, very good heat transfer properties, also high temperature, so you can get heat. And because you're not fabricating a fuel form, you have a lot of flexibility. So you can do recycling or materials management. And then there's one reactor company that's taking a molten salt coolant and TRISO particles that we typically use in gas reactors and combining them to get the heat transfer of the salt and the durability of the fuel. So it's a wild world out there. You can combine these things in a lot of ways.
That's how you get to 130 designs or whatever there are.
Yeah, exactly.
You talked about how many of these designs can then be made in different sizes. We talked about a gigawatt as the sort of standard size large nuclear power plant, the 300 megawatt that is now being built as a small modular reactor. There are some ideas for 200 and for 100. And nowadays, the thing that just blows my mind is people are talking about tiny nuclear reactors, 5 megawatt and 1 megawatt. And just so that we can put this in scale, 1 megawatt is about 500 houses worth of power if you're a UK consumer, and probably 200 houses if you're an American consumer. And so we are talking something that could sit in the backyard of a tiny neighborhood and just power the neighborhood. But I'm worried about those because with the large power plants, the 1 gigawatt or 300 megawatt, you have trained people who operate a power plant, who know what they're doing, who will keep this thing safe. What happens when you turn these designs into this small thing that will not have the economics to have a safety officer sitting next to the power plant running?
They're a totally different type of technology. So how much energy is in a gigawatt reactor is 1,000 times more than in a 1 megawatt reactor, right? And so the the volume of material, the intensity of the material. It's just a totally different scale. So what you need to keep that safe, you can design them so that they can't melt down and that they're tamper-proof, because it's just so much less heat to manage. So many fewer things can happen.
And so as DCVC, you have invested in this company called Radiant, and it is supposed to be making these small, very small reactors. So maybe we could take that example to try and explain to people, why do you think that it is okay to have one of these nuclear reactors in your backyard?
Yeah. And maybe it's because we talked about that I used to be a reactor operator. It was at a research reactor. It was 1 megawatt thermal, so about 3 times smaller than one of these. But like, I've operated one of them. It couldn't melt down. Nothing could really happen to it. I guess partly it's familiarity with what the safety really looks like and how safe they actually are. You know, at that reactor at Penn State, people would call and ask what the evacuation plan was. And we're like, there's no evacuation plan. Like, there's nothing can happen. I guess I'm just comfortable and knowledgeable about the safety features that that's not my concern.
What do they look like? How quickly can we have one? And where would they typically be used?
Great questions. They're a high temperature gas reactor, so they're using that super durable TRISO fuel with a helium coolant. The reactor plus the power conversion system, all of it fits into a shipping container, as you were talking about that as a scale. It's pretty small. Radiant is using a supercritical CO2 Brayton cycle to convert the power. So it's a bit more efficient, and that means they don't need water as a heat sink. So they can site very flexibly. They can be in arid environments. You just don't have water impact concerns.
Because the turbine that is being turned with the heat is not being turned by steam, it's being turned by hot CO2.
Yep, that's right. What are their applications? So microreactors, we do not expect that you're going to take 100 microreactors to get 100 megawatts and have that be on the grid and compete with utility scale. They're in remote locations. They're in emergency situations. They're in high reliability backup. So anywhere that you would have a diesel generator is where you could put a microreactor. So military bases, industrial facilities, remote communities. And for a lot of these places, diesel generators, one, they're expensive or they're smelly. They make a lot of local air pollution. They're loud. But also the logistics of getting diesel fuel is pretty complicated. And the more remote your location, I mean, there are places in Alaska where now the roads are melting more frequently. It's actually quite difficult to get fuel there, right? There's a real reliability and resilience issue around diesel fuel delivery.
Oh, yeah. I mean, especially for Defense Department, it would be a godsend, because one estimate of getting fuel to a battlefront is $400 a gallon.
Yeah.
50 to 80 times the cost of fuel that you can buy at the pump. And so if you have something like a microreactor, the Defense Department would be the first ones to buy a bunch of these.
And even diesel fuel at $6 or $8 a gallon, which is happens in a lot of places. You know, fuel doesn't have to be $400 a gallon for a microreactor to make sense. We also are forward looking at things like, okay, we want to build EV charging stations in the middle of the country. This is maybe less relevant in the UK. You're not as spread out, but trying to build transmission to have that charging station might be slower and more expensive than just building a microreactor. So there's a lot of like flexible applications.
If there is something like a microreactor doing a charging station in a remote area, how do you make this reactor stop? Because the whole point of a nuclear reactor is you start this chain reaction that is controlled. But if you're going to start and stop, how does a reactor deal with start and stop?
So we have control mechanisms, and you can ramp reactors, and then how rampable they are depends on the design. For large reactors, fuel is not that much of the cost of the reactor compared to the overall capital. So ramping the reactor to like save fuel doesn't make that much economic sense. For very small reactors, fuel is actually a much larger fraction of the cost of the system. And so it does make much more economic sense to ramp your reactor because it's just, again, it's so much smaller. some of the general rules that you would use for large reactors don't apply. So for small reactors, turning it down, turning it off, saving the fuel actually makes sense.
And so how exactly would you do it in a radiant reactor?
Yeah, so we have what are called control drums. So what control mechanisms do is they absorb neutrons. And so you can imagine the more neutron absorber you put in there, the reaction slows down, stops. And then when you remove that absorber, the reaction increases again. And so basically you just, in a controlled and thoughtful manner, you just add more neutron absorber until the reaction gets to the place where you want it to be. And then to turn it back up, you remove that neutron absorber.
And could that be instantaneous, like the way we do batteries, for example? You click a button, turns on and provides you power?
So shutdown can be instantaneous. Startup, slower than instantaneous. You need a little bit of time. But again, on 1 megawatt of reactor, a very small reactor, that time is like minutes. For a very large reactor, it's longer, right? So you have a longer time evolution. But microreactors are pretty responsive. But for all of them, if you put the control mechanisms in quickly, that reaction shuts down in seconds. The last thing is timeline. So Radiant, the company I work with, is on pace to demonstrate their reactor next year. So they will turn on their first full-scale demonstration reactor in 2026. That's actually pretty fast. So the company started in 2018, 2019, 2020, when they were just a few employees, to turning on a reactor in 2026. It will have cost them less than $200 million to do that. It's pretty good. They expect first commercial deployment in 2028. They're going to turn on that reactor at Idaho National Lab. There were recent announcements that they have the slot to go do that. They've got the fuel, they're rocking and rolling, and it's pretty exciting.
Join us after the break when I ask Rachel Slaybaugh how the economics of advanced nuclear reactors stack up. And while I have you, if you're finding this episode insightful, please give Zero a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's great to hear your feedback, and it helps new listeners find the show. Recently, a listener who goes by Maui Gardner said, Zero is an excellent place to find what's happening in climate tech. I'm not a techno geek, but I find the show fascinating and understandable. Thank you, Maui Gardner. And so microreactors, they'll have specific applications and they'll have specific economics, but the stuff that is going to make a difference on the energy transition writ large are small modular reactors. And so let's talk about the economics of those, because you started by saying they could be cheaper. The nuclear industry has promised cheaper power for a long time, but in the West, it's not quite delivering on that promise. So why do you think SMRs could do it?
I will say I'm not under the hood at any of the other SMR companies knowing the blow by blow of how the economics are really looking. So this is more from the outside philosophical. So as I mentioned, because we're not very good at mega projects, we do tend to be good at factory manufacturing. And so if you replace economy of scale with economy of numbers, right? So you're making a lot of the same thing over and over again. It's repeatable, it's modular, it's shippable, and you're limiting how much on-site work you're doing so that it's more rinse and repeat and less redesign for every location. We tend to do better and more predictably economically there. The other is because these reactors do have such high inherent safety, it is likely that we will need fewer systems and less complication to keep them safe. So it's not that we won't have safety systems, it's just that it's easier to do the safety systems. A lot of them, for example, don't operate at pressure. So large light water reactors, there's pressurized and there's boiling, but all of them operate at a pretty high pressure. So you need like thick steel vessels. If you don't need such a thick steel vessel that can only be made 1 or 2 places in the world, now that saves cost. So there's a lot of things that are simpler. And then by making them smaller, they can be fabricated more places. They can be 3D printed. You just have so much more flexibility and resilience in the supply chain. You don't need a that size of a crane. You don't need to dig up as much dirt. You don't need to pour as much nuclear grade concrete. Like just everything gets simpler.
So China has one small modular reactor that is actually connected to the grid today. Russia has built a small modular reactor that is on a floating ship that it can move around and provide power. And for all the talk in the West about small modular reactors, what the West has done, and to its credit, has innovated and developed lots and lots of interesting designs, but hasn't really built any. So why is it that if advanced reactors have these other properties that you're talking about, which would be smaller, cheaper to make, and something that the West could use, especially AI data companies could use, why is it that Russia and China are investing in actually building these things first?
Political will, mostly. They are structured differently, right? In China and Russia, it's very state-owned and top-down. Also, to some extent, the reason France has been so successful in nuclear is similar. And the United States and most of the West has more of a hybrid system where there's government involvement, but it's mostly free market, but also like quasi-free market. And so you end up with convoluted incentives sometimes. And so if the United States had decided this is for sure what we're going to do, we could do it. But the market drivers of real load growth to pull these things forward has only just happened, right? And so one could argue, yes, these are interesting designs and there was reason to care about them, but without the load growth to drive the demand, it's hard to move really anything forward. And now we're in that point in time. And then everyone's like, oh, but these aren't ready yet. And it's like, well, you got to you have to have that combination of planning ahead synced up with market signals. And so it's a little messy, but we're getting there.
In the future, we're going to bet on a bunch of technologies that are going to help us with the energy transition, with trying to meet this growing power. The competition for nuclear is going to be all of those. So the first competition is gas. The second competition is solar and wind combined with batteries of some sort, maybe long duration batteries. The third competition growing now is geothermal and advanced geothermal, which can also provide power all the time. Why do you think then nuclear is a good bet to make? Because all these other things have plenty of promise too.
It is good to have a resilient system where you have a variety of technology sources so that, for example, if everything was natural gas, electricity prices would be so subject to the price of natural gas, it would not be a very stable environment for businesses or consumers. Geothermal has a likelihood to be more stable. Geothermal is going to become viable in more and more locations, but it's not viable in every location. It makes sense to have a variety of technologies just in principle. And also, the amount of electricity growth we are talking about is so high, we don't have time to only build one thing. Like that just isn't going to work. You're going to have to build some of everything because you're going to need to exercise multiple supply chains and multiple skill sets and multiple people. There's such a fighting over the pie mentality. Like the pie is getting bigger. There's plenty of pie.
And what about the public perception of it? So we talked a little bit about safety, but there is real safety risk, and then there's perceived safety risk. And there is a lot of perceived safety risk around nuclear that holds back people's support for the technology. And it is not to say perceived safety risk is one that you should swipe away, because you have to convince people that this is something that is worth the money and something worth investing in for their interest, for their benefit. Are there places in the world where you think that has been done well, and what lessons can we draw from it?
It's a huge mix, and it actually is changing really actively. So we've seen among millennials and now Gen Z a much stronger openness to nuclear because climate change is the bigger concern. And you're right, perception of risk. Humans are very poor at risk perception for most types of risk. So nuclear is actually the safest form of energy that we have. But if there's an accident, it feels scary, and it's just, we can't have systems that can have accidents. So one of the things that I think is helpful about advanced reactors is that it is easier to make them safe. And so if you just get out of the category of it's even possible to have an accident or a meaningful accident, it's just simpler, because there's no world in which humans aren't going to think reactor meltdowns aren't scary. Just like driving is way more dangerous than flying. People are afraid of flying. They're not afraid of driving. It doesn't matter if it's dangerous or not. It's risk perception. The UK has actually overall done a good job. South Korea has done a medium job. Sweden has done a pretty good job. France has done a medium job. So it's a big mix. I think Switzerland has done a pretty good job. They're 50% nuclear, even though they're very small. And in the US, it's been changing. Part of it is how active is the opposition to nuclear energy. We didn't talk about this, but one of the things about nuclear that is so compelling is the fuel is incredibly efficient. So the reason it doesn't matter to save cost on fuel in those big reactors is you just need almost none of it. So a fuel pellet the size of the last nuncle of my pinky will make the same amount of energy as 1 ton of coal or 3 barrels of oil. And so you just don't have the same size of industry compared to some of these other industries. So you don't have as powerful of lobbying groups. So you don't have the same resources to go make sure people understand what the technology is. And you have competitor technologies that have quite a lot of resources that most anti-nuclear campaigns are funded by oil and gas.
Wow. Has that been proven?
Yes.
Wow. Expand on that. Like, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it used to be different, but like, who is the biggest loser if nuclear succeeds? It's oil and gas.
Yeah, but that's also true of wind and solar. And so like, then there has to be some lobby that renewables and nuclear come together. Is that happening?
Oh, you wish it would. Maybe someday. Both communities have too much of a small pie mentality, I would say, and don't recognize that they're actually fighting for the same thing.
So yes, it's an efficient fuel, and the amount of waste it produces relative to, say, fossil fuels, or even some of the renewable technologies, which are much less waste producing, but still do have some waste. Nuclear waste in volume is small, but there are 2 big problems with it. One is that the length of time that the waste could be radioactive and could be harmful is immensely long. We're talking thousands of years, which is, again, a timeline that human perception doesn't allow you to really understand. And then second, it's that so far, we've not really done a very good job of dealing with the nuclear waste we do have. So here in the UK, waste from nuclear weapons and from nuclear power plants is in one site in Sellafield. And yes, it's there and it's being managed, but it's also one which people are aware of and feel fear from. So what should we do with the waste problem?
Yeah, no, I would love to see us actually solve it. And there are a few countries that are, again, mostly smaller European countries where decision-making is simpler, that are making good progress on what to do with their waste. The biggest challenge with nuclear waste is that it's a problem with no urgency, because there isn't that much of it, and it's safe how it is for, like, it's safe today, it's safe next year, it's safe in 10 years, it's safe in 50 years. So who's going to expend the political capital and energy on solving the problem? So some of the issue is that it's fine how it is for now. And so it's really hard to get people to move on the topic. And because these solutions are long-term solutions in politicized environments, it's easy for them to be reversed. That's what happened in the US. So it may be that we'll piddle around to not solving it for long enough that we actually will just get recycling stood up, and then it's a simpler problem to solve.
What are the solutions that you think are working, though, which you consider as good solutions and in operation today?
Yeah, so you can do deep geologic storage, where basically you dig a hole deep in the ground that's a very well-studied and thoughtful hole, and you store it in casks underground. That's what most people are thinking about, is geologic storage. You also, for smaller volumes, you can do, there's a startup actually doing borehole storage, where you instead of making one big hole, you make some smaller holes and store it in a more dispersed fashion. There are some more exotic ideas that have never really gotten much purchase, like, oh, what if you put it in a deep sea subduction zone and let it get sucked back into the crust? I actually think it's a pretty good idea, but we don't know enough about the deep ocean maybe to satisfy what we would need to satisfy to say that was okay. And then there's recycling. And that's where, because nuclear fuel just isn't that expensive, it hasn't been economically viable to recycle. So far, it's only been a country like France where there's a strategic national interest of, they don't have that much fuel resource themselves, or they don't have any fuel resource themselves. They've gone all in on nuclear. And so recycling makes sense for them so that they can really extend their fuel supply.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Akshat. It was great to be here.
And thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That is the sound of a Formula E car racing in London, going at speeds of up to 320 kilometers per hour, indoors. Formula E is vying with Formula 1 to become the world's most popular racing sport, something we'll be covering in a future episode of Zero. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who is not a techno geek. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyd. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Eleanor Harrison Dengate, Somar Sadi, Moses Andem, and Siobhan Wagner. I'm Akshat Rathi, back soon.